The restaurant sat on the top floor of a glass-walled tower, a place where chandeliers dripped light like melting gold, and conversations floated in hushed tones instead of noise. The billionaire stepped through the wide entrance with the kind of quiet authority that made people glance over without knowing why. His tailored suit carried no logo, his shoes reflected the marble floor like a mirror, and the staff standing at the reception desk straightened as if on cue. He did not ask for a table. One had already been booked by his office days in advance, and the manager had spent the morning inspecting every detail of the private dining room where he would sit. The waitress assigned to the private room had been working at the restaurant for only 6 months, but she had quickly become known among her coworkers for her sharp memory and calm demeanor. She smoothed the black apron around her waist and adjusted the collar of her crisp white shirt before stepping into the corridor that led to the room. She had been told that a high-profile guest was arriving for an important lunch, but no one mentioned who he was or what the meeting involved. She did not yet know that the billionaire had come to finalize a $100 million deal that would ripple through industries and headlines alike. Inside the private room, a long, polished table stretched beneath a glowing pendant light. The city skyline fanned out beyond the glass walls, and the muted clink of glassware could be heard as another staff member placed water goblets and folded linen napkins at each setting. The waitress entered quietly, carrying a tray with 2 bottles of still water and 1 of sparkling, along with delicate stemware polished to clarity. She placed them on a side console and began setting each piece with practiced precision. Just as she finished, the door opened again, and the billionaire stepped inside, accompanied by an assistant who carried a slim leather portfolio and a tablet. The assistant's eyes moved around the room, checking for anything out of place. Satisfied, the assistant stepped back to allow the billionaire to take his seat at the head of the table. The waitress offered a polite greeting while keeping her tone neutral and professional. The billionaire acknowledged her with a slight nod, his eyes already drifting toward the file the assistant was opening. Minutes later, 2 potential investors arrived. Both wore the kind of suits tailored with quiet wealth, and each carried a folder with contracts and projections. They greeted the billionaire with practiced warmth, the kind used by people who handled large sums of money often enough to make it sound routine. The assistant seated them across from the billionaire, leaving 1 chair empty at the far end in case another guest arrived. The waitress moved in and out with the silence of habit, pouring water and offering menus while keeping an ear tuned to the rhythms of their conversation. The investors began discussing preliminary figures even before opening the menus. Words like merger, valuation, and stakeholders floated through the air. The billionaire listened more than he spoke, his fingertips pressed together as though weighing every syllable. When he did speak, his voice was quiet and steady, carrying the weight of someone who had negotiated deals across continents. The waitress stepped back to a corner of the room, watching unobtrusively in case someone lifted a hand for service. As the investors turned to their documents, one of them mentioned a quarterly projection that hinged on a formula used to estimate long-term returns. He spoke confidently, quoting numbers and percentages as though rehearsed, and the assistant tapped notes into the tablet with swift accuracy. The billionaire took the page handed to him and scanned it, his expression unchanged. The waitress, standing near the console with a tray of glasses, glanced down at the document as it passed from one investor to the assistant. She was not trying to read it, but the formula printed in bold caught her eye. During her final year before working at the restaurant, she had studied applied mathematics at a local college, though she had left the program before finishing due to circumstances she rarely discussed. Still, the symbols and variables were imprinted in her memory like familiar faces. The formula the investor had cited, something related to discounted cash flow, was written with a minor but critical error in the denominator. It was the kind of mistake that altered calculations dramatically, especially when scaled into the millions. She blinked once, unsure if she should look again or stay silent. It was not her place to interfere in conversations beyond ordering and service. Yet the part of her mind that had once solved equations in crowded libraries refused to dismiss what she had seen. The investor continued explaining the numbers with the assurance of someone who believed nothing could be wrong. The billionaire listened, occasionally making a note with a sleek fountain pen. The waitress turned to leave the room momentarily, carrying the empty tray back toward the kitchen corridor, but her thoughts remained with that one line of figures. She told herself it was none of her business. People in expensive suits surely knew what they were doing, and no one wanted input from someone wearing a name tag and balancing plates. Still, the unease lingered like a small stone in a shoe. By the time she returned with a basket of fresh bread and small plates of infused olive oil, the conversation had shifted to projections for the next fiscal year. The assistant placed a corrected draft on the table, and the investors nodded as if everything was progressing toward a signature. The billionaire took a slow sip of water and glanced toward the waitress briefly as she set the bread near the center of the table. There was no recognition in his eyes, only the detached focus of someone calculating margins and risks. She stepped back and folded her hands in front of her apron, waiting for any signal. The managers of the restaurant always emphasized that in private rooms, staff should be both available and invisible. The investors resumed talking, flipping pages and underlining figures. The assistant entered something into the tablet and pointed at a section that seemed crucial. The billionaire nodded once more. Far outside the dining room, the elevator chimed and footsteps echoed down the hallway, announcing the possible arrival of another associate. But inside, the weight of the conversation revolved around that formula, one error buried beneath layers of confidence, and the waitress stood only a few feet away, wrestling silently with the knowledge she had not asked to notice. She told herself again to focus on the duties assigned to her. The bread was warm, the plates were clean, and the next course would need to be timed once the orders were taken. Still, each syllable of the investor's projection triggered the memory of her professor, explaining how a misplaced variable in a long-term return formula could alter outcomes by tens of millions. She exhaled slowly, hoping that perhaps she had misread or misunderstood, but the certainty settled in her like cooling embers, quiet but not extinguished. The assistant signaled the waitress with a polite nod, indicating they were ready to order. She stepped forward with a discreet smile and presented the menus with both hands. The investors barely glanced at the pages, choosing dishes with the quick certainty of people accustomed to fine dining but uninterested in its details. The billionaire ordered last, selecting a simple entree and a cup of black coffee, specifying no sugar and no cream. The assistant requested a salad and nothing more, as though eating during negotiations were an inefficient use of time. Once the orders were taken, the waitress stepped out into the hallway, closing the door gently behind her. The corridor outside was quiet except for the muted clatter from the kitchen 2 floors down, carried faintly through vents. She walked toward the service station to hand the kitchen staff the order ticket, her fingers brushing the edge of the paper as she tried to shake off the thought of the flawed formula. 2 other servers were arranging plates for another private luncheon across the hall. One of them glanced at her and whispered something lighthearted about whales and their money, but she barely registered it. Instead, she pressed the ticket onto the kitchen line and stepped aside, watching chefs begin their coordinated dance with pans, knives, and steam. The head chef read the order without looking up, already knowing it was for the guests in the skyline room. The waitress filled a tray with fresh glasses and cloth napkins to bring back to the dining room. As she walked, she passed by the restaurant manager, who gave her an approving nod. The manager had chosen her for this service because she rarely made mistakes and stayed calm no matter the pressure. That reputation, however, did nothing to ease the internal struggle building in her mind. When she returned to the private room, the discussion had grown more intense. One investor had spread several sheets across the table, pointing to tables of numbers and charts. The billionaire leaned back slightly in his chair, one hand resting on the armrest while the other traced a line along the margin of a page. The assistant stood behind him, scrolling through a digital file that mirrored the printed documents. The waitress set the glasses quietly, listening as the conversation shifted to dividend forecasts and international expansion strategies. One of the investors referenced the same miscalculated variable as though it were the bedrock of the deal. Each repetition made her chest tighten a little more. She kept her head slightly bowed, hoping her expression did not betray her distraction. A cart arrived with appetizers from the kitchen, pushed by another staff member, but she took over the service to keep consistency. The plates were arranged with artistic precision, delicate portions placed atop painted swirls of sauce. She delivered the dishes one by one, placing them carefully in front of each guest without disrupting their papers. The investors offered quick nods of thanks, but their focus remained fixed on the billion-dollar future they believed they were constructing. As the waitress stepped back, the billionaire asked the investors to clarify the expected returns based on their projections. One of them answered confidently, citing percentages and timeframes that sounded impressive. The billionaire glanced at the assistant, who gave a slight nod, indicating that the numbers appeared consistent with the documents. The waitress, standing a few feet away, watched as a pen circled a figure derived from the incorrect calculation. Her palms began to warm despite the room's cool air. She retreated to the service console and pretended to adjust the placement of utensils to steady herself. Her breathing slowed as she tried to convince herself that it was not her responsibility to intervene. Interrupting could cost her job, and even if she said something, they might dismiss her as someone trying to insert herself where she did not belong. Yet the thought of a $100 million agreement being finalized on a flawed premise scraped at her conscience with increasing insistence. The investors paused briefly to taste the appetizers, but even that was done without ceremony. The billionaire cut through a piece of seared scallop and then set down his fork almost immediately, returning his attention to a page the assistant had annotated. The waitress collected the empty bread basket and replaced it with another, freshly warmed from the kitchen. Every movement she made was deliberate, choreographed by months of training and repetition. As she poured refill water into one investor's glass, she heard the phrase projected yield tied again to the incorrect formula. Her hand hesitated just slightly, enough for a single droplet to slide down the side of the glass. She wiped it with a cloth and stepped back, her heartbeat tapping a staccato rhythm in her ears. When the appetizers were nearly finished, the assistant excused herself to take a call in the hallway. The investors used the moment to confer privately, their heads bent together over the spreadsheets. The billionaire remained seated, staring out at the skyline as though weighing something intangible. The waitress watched him for a second longer than usual. Something about his expression suggested that his silence was not passive. He was a man who listened more deeply than he let on. A few minutes later, the door opened again, and another associate entered, a consultant with thick-framed glasses and a stack of supplementary reports. He greeted the billionaire and the investors, then laid out additional data that would support the upcoming signatures. The waitress stepped closer to the table to clear the plates as the men exchanged brief pleasantries. She moved carefully, collecting dishes without disturbing any documents. The consultant pointed to one report that used the same flawed formula but with a more elaborate presentation, complete with charts and projections. The waitress recognized the format instantly, something she had seen in academic papers and financial models during her time in school. Every instinct told her the trajectory of this deal was built on a mistake too large to ignore. As she carried the appetizer plates through the door and into the hallway, a final thought crystallized. If she stayed silent, the consequences would reach far beyond this room. She paused by the service station, setting the plates down more firmly than intended. For a long moment, she simply stood there, fingers pressed against the edge of the counter, as the sounds of the kitchen and dining areas receded. She knew she could not blurt out a correction in front of everyone. That would make her appear reckless and disrespectful. But if she approached the billionaire discreetly, perhaps while pouring his coffee, she might find a way to alert him without causing a scene. The very idea of whispering anything in his presence made her pulse quicken, but the alternative, doing nothing, felt heavier than the risk. A call went out from the kitchen that the entrees would be ready in a few minutes. She wiped her hands on her apron and took a slow breath. The next time she entered the private room, she told herself she needed to decide whether she would intervene or let events proceed down a path she knew was flawed. With the tray prepared for the next course, she turned back toward the private dining room. Her steps were steady, but her mind raced through possible phrases. How to say just enough without overstepping. The door loomed ahead, and she reached for the handle, unaware that the timing of her choice would change more than the numbers on a page. The door closed softly behind her as she stepped back into the private dining room. The investors were reviewing the consultant's packet now, comparing figures across pages with the illusion of absolute certainty. The billionaire rested his forearms on the table, his expression unreadable. The assistant had returned and was quietly typing updates into the tablet with practiced efficiency. The new associate sat slightly apart, flipping through his own copy of the report and occasionally murmuring agreement with the numbers being proposed. The waitress stood for a moment near the entrance, her tray balanced on one hand. She waited for the investors to pause, then began placing the entrees in front of them with the same quiet precision she had shown before. The dishes were arranged like artwork, perfectly seared cuts of meat, herb-crusted fish, vegetables shaped with surgical accuracy. The investors thanked her only in passing, their focus still locked on the financial landscape they believed they had mastered. Finally, she approached the billionaire. His plate was simple compared to the others. A lean portion paired with roasted vegetables and no garnish beyond a faint trace of oil. She paused as she set the dish down, glancing at the coffee cup that remained empty. For a moment, she considered using that as an opening, but the assistant reached for the carafe of water, interrupting the rhythm she had built in her mind. She stepped back, feeling the opportunity slip past like a closing elevator door. The investors resumed their discussion with renewed confidence. One of them pointed to a segment of the report that specifically cited projected compound returns over a 5-year period, returns calculated using the flawed denominator she could not ignore. Each sentence they spoke acted like a reminder that the window for correction would not remain open long. The assistant leaned down to murmur something to the billionaire, who nodded once and turned his attention to the consultant's packet. The waitress took that moment to retreat to the side table, where she adjusted glassware and plates with steady fingers. She grabbed the coffee service set from the tray she'd brought in and began preparing his cup silently, just as he had requested earlier. Black, no sugar, no cream. As she poured the coffee, the aroma rose gently, grounding her in the familiarity of routine. She lifted the cup and walked to his side, careful not to disturb any papers. He looked up briefly as she approached. It was the first direct acknowledgment of her presence since the meal began. She placed the cup near his right hand, and in that fleeting moment of proximity, her voice found a whisper. "Sir, that formula on page 3, one variable is inverted," she said barely above breath, her tone respectful but firm. The words left her lips before she had fully prepared herself for the consequences. The billionaire's eyes shifted slightly, not alarmed but sharply attentive. For a heartbeat, the entire room seemed to compress into silence, though no one else appeared to have noticed the exchange. She stepped back immediately, lowering her gaze and returning to the service console before anyone could question her. The investors remained engrossed in their discussion, unaware of what had passed. The assistant, however, had caught the billionaire's focus drift and responded with a quizzical glance. He said nothing, only slid the cup an inch toward himself and lifted the consultant's report again. His eyes scanned page 3 with a deliberate calm that masked any reaction. The waitress stood by the console pretending to arrange napkins, her heart thudding so loudly she feared it might draw attention. She did not dare look at him. She half expected the manager to be summoned at any moment, or worse, to be asked to leave the room in silence. Instead, the next sound was the subtle turn of a page under the billionaire's hand. He placed his finger against the section where the formula was printed and held it there for a long moment. Then, without glancing up, he murmured something to the assistant. The assistant blinked once, glanced over the billionaire's shoulder, and then picked up the tablet to cross-check the figures silently. No one else at the table seemed to notice the shift in energy, but the waitress felt it like a change in air pressure. The assistant typed quickly, eyes flicking between the screen and the printed report. After a full minute, she whispered something back to the billionaire, who gave a nearly imperceptible nod. He did not look in the waitress's direction again, but there was a new edge to the silence around his place at the table, an awareness, a recalibration. One of the investors asked if everything was satisfactory with the figures, interpreting the brief lull as a routine pause. The billionaire responded evenly that he wanted to confirm a detail before moving forward. He spoke without haste, as if clarity were simply part of the process rather than a disruption. The investor closest to him leaned forward, puzzled but polite. "Which detail?" he asked. The billionaire tapped the page with his pen. "This return formula," he said mildly. "I'd like to verify the denominator's configuration." The room stilled for a second, then one investor smiled dismissively. "Of course, it's standard. We've used it across all our projections." The billionaire handed the page to the assistant, who opened the corresponding file on the tablet and began scrolling through the original draft. The consultant, sensing the shift in tone, reached for his copy and traced the formula with his finger. His expression tightened slightly, though he said nothing. The waitress moved quietly around the table, refilling water glasses, careful not to interrupt. Her hands had steadied now that the words were spoken, but she still avoided lifting her gaze toward the head of the table. After a few moments, the assistant cleared her throat softly. "There is a discrepancy," she said, her voice controlled. "It appears the denominator is miswritten in the draft. The projection would be overstated using this version." The investors froze, their utensils suspended in midair. One blinked hard, as though the word miswritten had been uttered in a foreign language. The consultant looked down at his papers with sudden concentration, flipping to another page as though an alternative explanation might appear. The billionaire gave no visible reaction. He simply waited. The consultant spoke first, offering a cautious correction. "It might just be a formatting oversight. Easily updated before signatures." The billionaire raised a hand slightly, and the consultant fell silent. "We will not proceed until the correct formula is applied," he said quietly. There was no anger in his tone, only finality. The investors exchanged glances, and one of them muttered something about revisiting the calculations. The assistant was already revising the figures on the tablet, her fingers moving rapidly as she updated the model. The waitress stepped back to the corner of the room once more, her breath easing. No one had mentioned her, no one had asked who had caught the mistake. The billionaire did not thank her, but he did not need to. His reaction had confirmed that her whisper had landed exactly where it needed to. The conversation resumed, this time with an undercurrent of caution. The numbers were no longer spoken with inflated confidence, but with the care of people who had nearly walked over the edge of a cliff without seeing it. And though the investors tried to maintain composure, a subtle shift in hierarchy had taken place, one marked not by titles or suits, but by who had truly seen the numbers for what they were. The waitress stood silently at her post, wondering if the moment would pass without further consequence, or if the billionaire's attention would eventually turn to the only person in the room who had dared correct him. The assistant recalculated the figures on the tablet while the consultant reviewed his binder with increasing urgency. Pages turned faster now, and their earlier confidence had thinned to a fragile veneer. The billionaire watched silently, his coffee untouched, his posture unchanged. He rested one hand on the table, the pen still between his fingers, as though he had expected something like this to surface eventually. The investors tried to regain footing by discussing alternative valuation scenarios, but their voices had lost the casual authority they carried before. The assistant read new projections aloud, numbers that were significantly lower than those previously claimed. The silence that followed clung to the room like humidity, thick and unavoidable. The waitress stood by the wall, hands folded neatly, eyes lowered yet attentive. She could feel an almost imperceptible shift in the billionaire's presence. He was not angry, not surprised, but alert in a way he had not been earlier. It was as if that small whisper had triggered a silent recalibration of trust and perception, though none of it showed in his expression. The consultant spoke carefully, attempting to salvage the narrative. "Once we correct the model," he said, "the long-term gains are still competitive. The adjusted returns would reflect a conservative but stable trajectory." The billionaire did not respond immediately. He glanced at the assistant's tablet screen, then at the page in front of him. The investors waited, trying not to show impatience. One of them reached for a glass of water, his hand trembling slightly before he steadied it against the table. The waitress used the moment to quietly collect the empty appetizer plates that had been set aside earlier. The clink of ceramic against the tray was soft, but in the tense quiet, it sounded almost distinct. She lifted the plates with a smooth motion and stepped toward the door, As she passed behind the billionaire, she sensed his awareness follow her, not in suspicion, but in acknowledgment. In the hallway, she placed the dishes on the service cart and leaned briefly against the counter. Her pulse had finally calmed, though her mind continued to replay the moment she had spoken. No reprimand had come, no question had been asked. Yet the weight of what she had done lingered with a strange mix of fear and relief. When she re-entered the room, the tone of the conversation had shifted again. The assistant had finished recalculating and was now comparing the corrected projections to alternative scenarios. The consultant was nodding along, reshaping his pitch to fit the unexpected revision. The investors were trying to avoid appearing defensive, but their earlier certainty had dimmed. The billionaire finally spoke. "If the corrected numbers hold," he said slowly, "we'll revisit the terms. But any agreement will require full transparency going forward." The investors agreed immediately, their responses layered with eagerness disguised as professionalism. They spoke about updated documents, revised forecasts, and the importance of precision. Their voices carried undertones of apology without using the word itself. The assistant handed the tablet to the billionaire and quietly excused herself to print the revised version. She left the room with swift steps, her expression composed but intent. The consultant used the moment to reorganize his binder, sliding out the flawed pages and setting them aside. The waitress resumed her position near the corner, preparing to serve the next course. She checked the time discreetly. The kitchen would be delivering the final plate soon. Yet the air in the room felt different now, more grounded, less inflated by assumption. One of the investors attempted to revive the conversation with light humor, but it fell flat. The billionaire was reviewing the tablet with the same detachment he had shown earlier, though his focus now seemed less routine and more pointed. Every so often, his gaze flicked toward the formula and lingered. The door opened again, and the assistant returned with freshly printed documents. She distributed them around the table, placing the updated pages directly over the flawed ones. The investors studied them with tight expressions, nodding in unison at numbers far less ambitious than before. As the men resumed their negotiation, this time built on something closer to reality, the waitress carried in the final course. The plates were rich in presentation, though the energy in the room had softened their impact. She served each dish with the same careful grace, moving between chairs like a shadow. When she approached the billionaire's place, he paused his reading just long enough for their eyes to meet. The glance was brief but intentional, an acknowledgment without words. No smile, no nod, no spoken thanks. Yet in that second, something passed between them. Recognition not of status, but of awareness. She stepped back once more, folding her hands at her waist. The assistant resumed typing, the investors recalibrated their tone, and the consultant moderated his language with greater caution. The billionaire closed the folder in front of him and sipped his coffee at last, the steam having faded to a thin ribbon. Not long after, he set the cup down and asked the investors to step outside with him after the meal to discuss the revised structure privately. The consultant and assistant began gathering supplemental materials. The investors agreed quickly, though tension edged their politeness. The waitress continued her duties quietly, but she could tell the trajectory of the meeting had shifted permanently. The numbers had changed. The tone had changed. The unspoken hierarchy in the room had changed. And though no one outside their circle would know how narrowly a miscalculation had almost shaped the outcome, the balance of the deal now rested on a truth that only one person had dared to speak aloud. She moved back to her station, unaware that the most consequential moment of the day had not yet arrived. The final course gradually disappeared from the plates, though few at the table seemed truly focused on the food. The billionaire finished his entree with composed efficiency, while the investors picked at theirs, their movements slower and more tentative than before. The consultant carefully tucked away the pages he no longer intended to reference, as though burying them deep enough could erase the memory of their mistake. The assistant remained composed, but there was a sharpened focus to the way she handled each document, an understanding that what almost went unnoticed could have reshaped everything. When the plates were cleared, and the investors began discussing the location of their follow-up meeting, the billionaire pushed his chair back slightly. The waitress stepped forward instinctively, gathering the empty settings with quiet precision. She kept her gaze lowered and her posture neutral, but she could sense that the atmosphere in the room no longer floated on assumptions. Everything now rested on a recalculated foundation. The assistant closed the tablet and stood beside the billionaire, ready to accompany him once the investors stepped out for the private discussion he had requested. The consultant and investors gathered their papers, offering half-hearted small talk that struggled to fill the silence. No one spoke directly of the mistake, no one asked who had caught it, and no one dared imply the oversight was insignificant. The billionaire stood. The movement was calm, unhurried, but absolute. The investors followed, one adjusting his jacket, another sliding his folder under his arm with more force than necessary.